The air in Lincolnshire, England, was thick with the scent of damp earth and honest labor. A young man named John Hunt, barely more than a boy, pushed a plow through the stubborn soil, the rhythmic turning of the earth a familiar comfort. His hands were calloused, his back strong, his formal education minimal. He was, by all accounts, destined for a quiet life, a humble life, spent in the fields he knew so well. Yet, even as the rich soil crumbled around his boots, another world, a world of unimaginable savagery and desperate need was calling him. A world where the very ground was soaked not with rain, but with blood, and the air carried the acrid smoke of human sacrifice. This was Fiji, the Cannibal Isles, a place so utterly beyond the pale of civilization that merely uttering its name evoked shudders of dread. And it was there, in that heart of darkness, that this uneducated plowboy would become a beacon, burning so brightly and so fiercely that his light would transform an entire nation, though it would consume him entirely in the process. John Hunt was not born into privilege or academic renown. He was born in 1812 in the unassuming village of Swaby. His early life was defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of farm work. He had no grand theological degrees, no oratorical training from prestigious universities. In fact, when he first expressed a desire to serve as a missionary, he was met with polite but firm dismissal. He was told he was too uneducated, too rough-hewn for such a sacred and intellectual calling. Imagine the sting of that rejection, the quiet humiliation of being deemed unfit for the very purpose that consumed his soul. But within that humble frame burned a will of iron, and a conviction so profound it dwarfed the skepticism of his peers. He refused to be defined by their limitations. He immersed himself in study, devouring books by candlelight after grueling days in the fields, his mind alight with a hunger for knowledge that matched his spiritual fervor. He would prove them wrong, not with arrogance, but with an unshakable devotion that would shatter all expectations. By the age of 26, John Hunt had defied the odds. He was deemed ready not by the standards of human academia, but by the undeniable evidence of a heart wholly surrendered. In 1838, with his young wife Hannah by his side, he set sail for the Antipodes, leaving behind the green fields of England for a horizon that promised only danger. Their destination was the Fiji Islands, a scattering of volcanic landmasses in the vast Pacific, where the beauty of the palm-fringed beaches belied a horrifying reality. This was a land steeped in ancient traditions of war, ritual sacrifice, and cannibalism. Explorers and traders who dared venture too close often met gruesome ends, their stories serving as macabre warnings to others. The Fijian society was stratified by powerful chiefs, often ruthless, who wielded absolute power, their commands enforced by fearsome warriors whose clubs were stained with the blood of countless enemies. For a European to step onto these shores was not just an act of courage, it was an act of profound, almost suicidal faith. Imagine the young Hunts stepping onto that hot, humid beach. The air would have been heavy with the unfamiliar scent of tropical flora, mixed with something else, something primal and unsettling. The sight of armed, painted warriors, the unfamiliar sounds of a language utterly alien, the constant underlying tension of a society where life was cheap and death could come swiftly and brutally. Most would have seen a hellish landscape, a place beyond redemption. John Hunt, however, saw something different. He saw a failing harvest. He saw souls in desperate need, not monsters to be feared. This was his battlefield, and he approached it not with a sword, but with an open heart and an unyielding commitment to his God and to the people of Fiji. The first, monumental task was language. The Fijian language was intricate, complex, and utterly foreign to a mind trained on English grammar. Yet Hunt, the uneducated plowboy, tackled it with a ferocity that astounded even native speakers. He immersed himself completely, living among the people, listening intently, painstakingly deciphering the nuances of their speech. He wasn't just learning words. He was learning their world, their culture, their intricate belief systems, their fears, and their hopes. Within a remarkably short time, he not only mastered the language, but began the monumental task of translating the New Testament. This was not a casual endeavor. It was an act of profound cultural bridge building, an attempt to transpose the very essence of a distant faith into the heart of a people whose worldview was entirely different. His days were a relentless cycle of study, teaching, and precarious living. Life in Fiji was a constant test of endurance. Sickness was rampant. The tropical climate brought with it unfamiliar diseases that ravaged the small missionary community. The constant threat of violence from warring tribes loomed large. There were times when the missionaries' homes were surrounded by hostile warriors, their lives hanging by a thread, dependent on the fickle whims of a chief. Yet, through it all, Hunt pressed on, driven by a philosophy he called total consumption. He believed that a life truly lived for God was one that burnt out entirely in service. Rather than rusting out in complacent inactivity, he poured every ounce of his energy, every flicker of his spirit, into the work. He spent countless hours hunched over his desk, the flickering oil lamp casting long shadows as he painstakingly translated scripture, his mind racing to find the precise Fijian word that would convey the depth of grace or the power of redemption. His influence began to spread, slowly at first, like tendrils reaching into the dense jungle. One of his most significant encounters, and indeed one of the most remarkable stories in missionary history, was with Ratu Seru Epenisa Cakobau, later known as King Cakobau. Cakobau was, for much of his early life, the epitome of the Fijian warrior chief, powerful, ruthless, and deeply involved in the traditional practices, including cannibalism, that defined his era. He was a man of immense physical presence and political acumen, ruling over a significant portion of Fiji with an iron fist. He was not easily swayed by the words of a foreign preacher. Hunt, however, understood that to transform Fiji, one had to reach its leaders. He patiently and persistently presented the Christian message, not as a gentle suggestion, but as a compelling alternative to the cycle of violence and fear that gripped the islands. He spoke not of abstract theology, but of a God who offered true peace, forgiveness, and a life beyond the grave that was not dictated by the appeasement of vengeful spirits. It was a long, arduous process, marked by skepticism, resistance, and the deep-seated pride of a powerful ruler. The path to Cakobau's conversion was not a direct line, but a winding river filled with both floods and droughts. There were times of openness, followed by retreats into traditional ways. There were political machinations, tribal rivalries, and the immense pressure of his people and fellow chiefs to maintain the status quo. To convert to the Lotu, the Fijian word for Christianity, meant not just a change of personal belief, but a radical societal upheaval, abandoning ancestral gods, forsaking polygamy, and, most controversially, ending the practice of cannibalism and the ritualistic sacrifice of war captives and even widows. Hunt's unwavering commitment, his willingness to live among the people, his evident selflessness, and the quiet power of the message he preached began to chip away at Cakobau's defenses. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic lightning bolt, but a gradual awakening. The stark contrast between the missionaries' lives dedicated to service and peace, and the constant brutal cycles of war and retribution in his own society must have been undeniable. Eventually, the weight of the message, combined with internal political pressures and the growing influence of Christianity among some of his people, led to Cakobau's pivotal decision. In 1854, Cakobau publicly converted to Christianity. This wasn't merely a personal declaration, it was a seismic event that reverberated across the entire archipelago. The king of cannibals had embraced the Lotu. This act, more than any other, marked the beginning of the end for the old ways of Fiji. It initiated a profound transformation, turning the tide irrevocably towards a new era. Cakobau's conversion wasn't just a victory for Hunt, but a testament to the power of a faith that could pierce the darkest strongholds of human culture. It signaled that Fiji, once synonymous with terror, was now on a path to becoming a nation where the sound of church bells would eventually replace the drums of war. The demands on Hunt's body and spirit were immense. The perpetual humidity, the malarial fevers, the relentless intellectual strain of translation, the emotional toll of living amidst such violence, and the spiritual burden of carrying the hopes of a nation took their toll. He pushed himself beyond human limits, driven by an urgency that few could comprehend. He knew his time was short, and there was so much to do. He worked day and night, his slender frame wasting away, his eyes often red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Yet, he refused to slow down. The idea of leaving the New Testament unfinished, of leaving the Fijian people without the full scripture in their own tongue, was unthinkable to him. His final years were a heartbreaking testament to his total consumption. He battled chronic illness, his body racked with pain and fever, yet his mind remained lucid, his spirit unyielding. He continued his translation work, his quill scratching across the paper, words of salvation flowing from his mind onto the page, even as his own life force ebbed away. He was, quite literally, bleeding onto the page, pouring his very essence into the task. The physical agony he endured was immense, but his focus remained singular. Lord, bless Fiji. Save Fiji. On the 16th of October, 1848, at the age of just 36, John Hunt's short, incandescent life flickered out. Imagine the scene. A small, humble room in a remote mission station, far from the green fields of his childhood. His wife Hannah, weary and heartbroken, by his side. A few Fijian converts, their faces etched with grief, understanding the immeasurable loss they had just experienced. As he lay dying, his final words were not for himself, not a lament for a life cut tragically short, but a fervent, whispered prayer. Lord, bless Fiji, save Fiji. Even in his last breaths, his heart beat for the people he had come to serve, the people who had once practiced cannibalism, the people for whom he had given absolutely everything. His death was a moment of profound sorrow, but it was not the end of his story. It was merely the turning of a page. The seeds he had sown, often watered with his own sweat and tears, had taken root. The New Testament, completed in his final agonizing efforts, became a living testament to his sacrifice. It was a book that spoke directly to the hearts of the Fijian people, liberating them from fear and superstition, guiding them into a new era. The impact of John Hunt's brief, fiery life is almost incomprehensible. Within decades of his death, the Cannibal Isles were transformed. The practice of cannibalism, once rampant, faded into history. The incessant tribal wars diminished. Churches, simple structures of wood and thatch, began to dot the landscape. The Fijian people, once feared for their savagery, embraced a faith that preached peace, forgiveness, and love. So profound was this transformation that by the turn of the century, Fiji boasted more churches per capita than almost any other nation on earth. It became, in a remarkable reversal, a beacon of Christianity in the Pacific. John Hunt's life is a stark, challenging paradox. He lived only 36 years, a mere flicker in the grand sweep of history. Yet, his impact was more profound, more enduring, than many who lived to a ripe old age, accumulating wealth or power. He was an uneducated plowboy who became a linguistic master and a spiritual titan. He was told he was not enough, but he proved to be more than enough. He didn't just preach to the cannibals, he died for them, consumed by a love that transcended cultural barriers and personal safety. His life was not one of comfort or recognition, but of relentless, agonizing self-sacrifice. He truly embodied his philosophy of total consumption, a burning out for a cause far greater than himself. His story stands as a blazing challenge to us all. In a world that often values comfort, longevity, and self-preservation above all else, John Hunt asks us, what are we truly living for? What cause, what purpose, what love is so profound that we would willingly, joyfully burn ourselves out for it? What is so important that, on our deathbed, our final words would not be a regret for a life unfulfilled, but a desperate, passionate plea for the blessing of others? John Hunt, the plowboy of Lincolnshire, became the apostle of Fiji. His short life cast an impossibly long shadow, proving that true greatness is not measured in years, but in the intensity of one's burning light, consumed entirely for the sake of others. His life, and his last breath, continue to echo across the Pacific, a testament to a love that saved a nation.